During World War II, the United States of America was at war in two oceans. In the Atlantic, there was Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and their allies. And in the Pacific, there was the mighty Japanese Empire. But what led to our involvement in the war? And why was Japan, who just 2 centuries before didn't even trade with other nations, now trying to invade them? Well, let's find out. In 1868, the shogun, the militaristic dictator of Japan, was dethroned and the emperor was returned to power. At this time, things weren't going well in Japan. The Western powers in America and Europe had been kind of kicking them around for a while, and had forced them into some unfair treaties. So when the emperor took power, he decided, alright, let's try and turn things around. Taking inspiration from many of the Western powers, the emperor abolished the feudal states and replaced them with prefectures, replaced the warring feudal armies with the united conscription-based national military, and set up a parliament called the Diet. Seeing this, the Western powers finally agreed to revise their treaties. They were finally Western enough for the West. But many conservatives in Japan thought that the country was becoming too westernized. They were attempting to play the Western powers' game, but they were centuries late. Europe and the US liked them now, but who's to say they wouldn't drop them the moment their views no longer aligned? In 1894, Japan decided they needed more resources, so they went with war to China to get some. Their victory gave them not only the Korean peninsula, but also Taiwan and a sphere of influence in the Chinese Liaotung province. Within a week, though, the Western powers of France, Germany, and Russia pressured Japan to give up its sphere of influence in Liaotung, and then took advantage of the now weakened China to make their own spheres of influence. Japan was, reasonably, enraged. So in 1904, when Russia, the country that now had control of the Liaotung province, threatened to establish control over Korea, Japan wasn't having it. They declared war, and, in a turn of events that shocked the world, they won. Things were looking good in Japan as they entered the Taisho period. During World War I, they took advantage of Germany's preoccupation with Europe to take German-controlled islands in the Pacific and widen their sphere of influence in China. They went to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference as one of the great military powers of the New Age, and were given a permanent seat in the League of Nations. Everything was going great forever and nothing bad could ever happen. As the Taisho period ended and the Great Depression began in America, things started to go downhill for Japan. America passed a law restricting Japanese people from immigrating to the US, enraging the Japanese people and government. The country delved into an economic depression, and the political parties became ripe with corruption. Because of this, the military and core government became more powerful, while the parliament became weaker. Once again, conservatives in Japan blamed westernization. They said their new government was weak, and they needed to return to their tradition. From this, a far-right nationalist movement began to gain traction throughout Japan. First, it rose through the military, then the civilian government. The now weakened parliament was easily intimidated and threatened by the military, making them relatively useless. At the head of that new militant group is a man named Hideki Tojo, a general and son of a revered samurai that believed that too much of Asia was controlled by the West. And the new emperor agrees, so now he's prime minister. In 1931, the Imperial Japanese Army invaded a part of North China called Manchuria, which was rich in iron and oil. Against the calls from the West to end their expansion, in 1937, Japan went south and invaded deeper into China. The Japanese army committed a bunch of war crimes that the government still denies ever happened, and they continued on. They continued south into French Indochina, taking advantage of the point that France had just recently stopped existing. Germany, Italy, and Japan decided to sign a treaty and became the Axis powers. Japan needs, you'll never guess, more resources, so they decide they need to go even more south to the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and the US-controlled Philippines. But there was just one problem. The US controlled the Philippines. If they attacked the Philippines, then they'd go to war with the US, and they knew they couldn't defeat their navy. But then, Japan had an idea. What if we destroyed their navy before we even went into battle? So they bombed the US Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It kinda sorta worked, in the sense that they did destroy a lot of battleships, but failed to destroy any aircraft carriers or ship-fixing depots, and kinda just made the Americans angry, and whoops, looks like the US and their entire navy just declared war on Japan. Who could have seen this coming? Because of their treaty, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy also declare war on America. So at least they won't be using their whole power against Japan. But things aren't looking good for Tojo's empire. And even worse, only a year or two before this, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had signed off on the Manhattan Project, which aimed to create a new bomb, greater than anything the world had ever seen before. Foreshadowing is a dramatic device in which Japan took advantage of the momentarily stunned US Navy to sweep through Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Islands, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Thailand, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, the Solomons, and started to invade New Guinea. They began planning to expand even more into New Guinea, and to begin invasions of New Britain, the Aleutians, Midway, Fiji, Samoa, and Australia in what they called the Second Operational Phase. On March 8th, 1942, they began their invasion of New Guinea, officially kicking off the beginning of the second operational phase, but knock knock, it's the United States of America. 2 days after the attack, an American aircraft carrier attacked the invasion force, forcing the army to stop their advances and regroup. This, combined with the Doolittle raids over Japanese soil, began to break Japan's undefeatable image and bolster the Americans. Despite all this, though, an admiral named Isoroku Yamamoto had an idea of how to deal with the pesky American forces once and for all. They trapped them at the island of Midway. It seemed like a simple idea. A small invading force would attack and take the small American-controlled island of Midway, and when the Americans attempted to retaliate, a second, much bigger Japanese force would surprise them. But because of some sneaky code-breaking by one Joseph Rochefort, the Americans knew about the trap beforehand and planned accordingly. Despite some large mess-ups by the Americans in the beginning of the battle, with the power of some bad decision-making on Yamamoto's part, the Americans not only won the battle, but destroyed most of Japan's aircraft carriers and turned the tide of war in their favor. The main advantage that the US had over Japan was its industrial might. The Americans had already been manufacturing weapons and vehicles since 1939, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they really kicked things into high gear. In the 3 years after the Battle of Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. America built 17. In August of 1942, the Allied forces began their new offensive with their amphibious invasion of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. This kicked off a long, two-pronged campaign in which the US would inch closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, island by island. The plan was when they got close enough, they could start doing aerial raids over Japan and eventually land an amphibious invasion on the main island. Operation Cartwheel recaptured the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the New Georgia campaign took control of New Georgia, and now the island hopping could really begin. Next fell the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and Japan began to focus their forces back on mainland Asia, bolstering campaigns in China and India. Despite multiple Japanese offensive and attempts to stop them, America continued to inch closer and closer. In June of 1944, they took Mariana Islands and Saipan in July, Tinian in August, and Guam a week later. Saipan and Tinian were very important as the US was now close enough to mainland Japan to attempt bombing raids over Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. There were very few islands left between the American forces and Japan, so Japan decided to put all of their effort into defending them. Despite the ingenious and brutal opposition on Iwo Jima, America was able to take control of the island in March of 1945, bringing them close enough to begin devastating firebombing raids over the wooden Japanese cities. The final stop between Iwo Jima and Japan was Okinawa, and because of this, it saw some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war. But in early July, the islands were taken, and now there was nothing left between America and Japan. But if the fighting in Okinawa and Iwo Jima were anything to go by, an amphibious invasion of Japan would be an absolute bloodbath on both sides. America started looking for alternatives, a way to get Japan to surrender before they had to invade. Luckily for them, they had an ace up their sleeve. In July, the Manhattan Project, remember that, successfully tested the first atomic bomb in history, and they were now ready to be used. On July 6th, the United States dropped one of these devastating A-bombs on the city of Hiroshima, and 3 days later they dropped another on Nagasaki. The next day, Japan surrendered, and the Pacific War, along with World War II, was over.